When's the last time you just ate a meal? I mean, really just ate it. No phone, no screen propped against your water glass, no scrolling with one thumb while your fork does its thing. Just you and the food. Can't remember? Okay. Well, when's the last time you actually fell asleep instead of lying there in the dark, running the day through your head on a loop, replaying things that you said, or rehearsing an email that you need to write? Your body's in bed, but you're somewhere else completely, stiff as a board, waiting for a rest that won't come because you never actually let go. There are two things a person is supposed to be able to do: be all the way in something and be all the way out of it, fully present or fully at rest. And if you're anything like the rest of us, you've pretty much lost the ability to do either one. You're half there at dinner, you're half there in bed, you're half here right now, probably, with this playing in the background while you do something else. Now, somebody noticed this about people and the impact that it has on them. They wrote it down too, but they didn't write it down yesterday or a decade ago. It was 2,500 years ago in China, in 6 little characters at a time. Tiny fragments. Blink your eye and you'd miss them. When eating, he did not talk. In bed, he did not lie like a corpse. Sounds like nothing, right? Sounds like somebody's note about table manners. But it isn't. It's a diagnosis, and it's pointing right at you. 3 passages today: a meal, a temple, and a bed. 3 little windows into one skill almost none of us have anymore: the skill of actually being where you are. Exploring the Analects, Episode 7, Passages 10.10, 10.21, and 10.24. Somebody needs a vacation. Hey folks, this is Elliot Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for Episode 7 of Exploring the Analects. Today we'll be talking about passages 10.10, 10.21, and 10.24 of the Analects. 3 phrases of 6 characters each, all focused on the habits and behaviors of Confucius. In case you're just joining us, here's a little bit about the podcast. We're discussing the Analects, a collection of hundreds of passages focused on the philosophy and teachings of Confucius. These passages were written and compiled by followers of the Confucian Way in China between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE. They touch on a whole range of topics that can still teach us how to live our lives today. Each episode is focused on 1 or more passages. I introduce the passages, give informal translations, read the Chinese, then provide more faithful translations. After that, we talk about the meaning of the passages with historical and cultural notes. Then I discuss language points for students of Chinese. Finally, I comment on the place in the Analects of these passages, as well as any varying interpretations that might not have fit in elsewhere. The first 6 episodes of this series each focused on 1 passage only, but today we'll be looking at 3. I'm doing this because these 3 passages all come from Book 10 of the Analects, and they're thematically similar. They even contain similar language and grammatical constructs. I think this is going to work out just fine, but it's a bit of an experiment. So if this departure really just wasn't what you were looking for, please let me know. I'm always looking for feedback on what I can do to keep the show engaging and informative. Now that that's covered, let's get started with my informal interpretation of these passages. These interpretations tend not to stick to the Chinese, but they do capture something about the spirit of the passages that I think will help you make sense of them. Anyway, here it is. My boss is a real piece of work. He can't shut up. We'll go to lunch and he'll just talk through the whole meal with his mouth full. His wife even sent him to therapy because he'll talk until the second he falls asleep. She said he lays there stiff as a board all night, and as soon as he wakes up, he stands there all puffed up like he's receiving some medal of honor. He walks into work like that too, but he doesn't look at us or say good morning or anything. He just heads straight into his office and closes the door. Somebody needs a vacation. Well, just in case my boss is listening, I swear to God, this isn't about you. Next up, I'll read the passages in a modern Mandarin pronunciation. Then we'll follow up with a more faithful translation into English by Professor Pei-Min Ni from his excellent book, Understanding the Analects of Confucius. 10.10 食不語 寝不言 When eating, he would not converse. When lying in bed, he would not talk. 10.21 入太庙没事问 When he entered the grand temple, he asked about everything. 10.24 寝不施居不容 In bed, he did not lie like a rigid corpse. At home, he did not assume formal deportment. Now let's dive in a little deeper and discuss some of the interpretations and ideas behind these phrases. This section might appeal to you if you're interested in the philosophical, historical, or cultural context behind the Analects. Following that, I'll talk a bit about the language. I normally save discussion of a passage's location within the Analects as a whole toward the end of each episode. But today, I'm going to do that up front. That's for two reasons. First, all three of these passages appear in Book 10. And second, Book 10 stands out among all chapters of the Analects for its stylistic and thematic differences. If you listen to Episode 3, where we discussed passage 10.12 about Confucius's view on sitting mats, you might remember some of this since we covered it as well in that episode. But I'm adding context as well based on some of my recent reading that actually makes a lot of sense considering the anomalies of Book 10. Book 10 of the Analects is known as Xiangdang, or Confucius in his hometown. This book is different because it doesn't have any quotes of Confucius in it. There's none of that 子曰 stuff that Confucius said that you see at the beginning of so many passages in other books. Instead, it's a collection of descriptions of behavior and rituals. And ostensibly, these are descriptions of Confucius's habits, life, and preferences. Many of these focus on what you might consider minutiae, things like the way he walked when he was going to greet guests, the clothes he wore at different times of year, and the food he would and would not eat. But what I've learned recently is that this book may not originally have been about Confucius at all. Edward Slingerland, whose translation I've mentioned in several other episodes, is a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia, whose analysis often takes both a qualitative and quantitative approach. And here's what he writes about Book 10. Based on their style, lack of explicit subject, and parallels to be found in other early ritual texts, such as the Record of Ritual or Book of Etiquette and Ritual, Scholars have concluded that most of the passages in this book were probably culled from a lost ritual text that provided anonymous guidelines and injunctions for the aspiring gentleman. From earliest times, however, this book has been viewed by commentators as an extended description of the ritual behavior of Confucius in particular, and it was probably intended by the editors of the earliest stratum of the Analects to be understood that way. So, are we talking about Confucius in these passages? Maybe not. We might have a stronger argument against this in this case, but there's no guarantee any of the Analects is a direct reflection of Confucius. Between its age, multiple anonymous authors and editors, and the competing agendas of different schools formed by disciples that we know influenced the final work, we really can't be certain what reflects the historical figure versus the Confucius created by tradition. As much as we talk about Confucius on this podcast, like the title says, this is an exploration of the Analects. It's using the Analects not specifically to teach you about the Confucian tradition or the man himself, but to dig into just about anything and everything we can learn from these passages, whether that's historical, philosophical, ethical, linguistic, or just about anything else that stands out to me. So I'm going to move ahead with the idea that these passages were just as likely culled from a lost ritual text as anything else, and see where that gets us. Let's get started with that, first looking at passage 10.10. As a reminder, this passage says, "When eating, he would not converse. When lying in bed, he would not talk." Some translations render converse as instruct, which does make a little more sense, since conversation is common for many people during meals, but few people would want to attempt teaching a lesson while eating. If we're taking this as a guidebook, it makes more sense to read this passage as an imperative, in which case it would be, don't converse while eating, and don't talk while you're lying down to sleep. Overall, this seems like reasonable and practical advice, even in the modern age. Concentrate on what you're doing. Try not to multitask. If we take Book 10 as less of an etiquette guide and more of a guide for ritual propriety, then we get a slightly different interpretation. That is, these aren't instructions for everyday life. They're instructions for how you should act when preparing for or conducting a ceremony. In 6th century BCE China, some rituals took days to prepare for, as well as days to conduct. Other passages in the Analects describe the fasting and purification that would be done in preparation for some such rituals. And taking both eating and resting seriously during a ceremonial activity lines up well with those preparations. These are solemn events, and if the participants did not approach them with the proper attitude, it was tantamount to not doing them at all. Passage 3.12 states, "Sacrificing as if present. When sacrificing to the spirits, do it as if the spirits were present. The master said, 'If I did not participate in a sacrifice, it is no different from not having done the sacrifice.'" Next up is 10.21. "When he entered the grand temple, he asked about everything." If we rephrase this in the imperative as we did with the first passage, we get, "When you enter the grand temple, ask about everything." There's also a small clarification that's needed in this translation, which is that the everything being asked about refers to events or activities. It doesn't refer to things. So the point is not that someone is walking into the temple and pointing at every ritual vessel asking, "What's this one? What's that one?" It's that they're asking about how things are going, who's been doing what, who's acting in what capacity, and so forth. Again, the point here is that if you're taking part in an activity and you're not wholeheartedly engaged in that activity, then you might as well not be doing it. So it's best to do one thing at a time and truly focus on doing that one thing while you do it. One thing that you should know in order to understand this passage is what a grand temple was. A grand temple was the main ancestral temple of a state or empire in historical China. This was the location where tablets or artifacts would be stored in order to venerate the founders of the state, and where rituals would be conducted in an attempt to ensure continued peace and prosperity for the state. In Confucius's home state of Lu, the Grand Temple was dedicated to the founder of the state, Zhou Gong, the Duke of Zhou. The Duke of Zhou was perhaps the most consequential figure during the earliest years of the Zhou dynasty, and someone who we will surely be discussing in great depth in future episodes. If we interpret this passage as a guide to etiquette, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Instructing anyone visiting the Grand Temple to ask about everything would probably be giving bad advice. It's just a guess on my part, but most people likely did not even get a chance to enter the temple. And if they did, to suddenly start asking questions about everything would not be the way they were expected to act. So we can ignore this interpretation. Taken as an instruction for ritual propriety, however, we do get a lot farther. For a practiced rujia or ritualist like Confucius, or anyone who was training to reach that level, asking questions might have been a way of engaging. You could think of it almost like a manager walking into their office. If the manager goes directly through the main office and into their private office without greeting people and seeing what's going on, they'd likely appear negligent. But if they ask questions and find out what's been happening, it shows they care. Passage 3.15 puts this practice in terms of Confucius's own behavior with the following anecdote. When the master entered the Grand Temple, he asked about everything. Someone said, "Who says that Confucius understands the rituals? When he enters the Grand Temple, he asks about everything." The master heard the remark and said, "This is itself a ritual." Finally, passage 10.24. In bed, he did not lie like a rigid corpse. At home, he did not assume formal deportment. Rephrasing this in the imperative, we get, do not lie in bed like a rigid corpse. Do not assume formal deportment at home. Neither of these statements make sense as instructions on ritual propriety, so it's most likely a guide to etiquette, or even more general advice about how to live one's life. Both lying in bed like a rigid corpse, as well as acting too formally while at home, are likely to leave you feeling drained and uncomfortable. So the advice is to relax and make yourself comfortable when you're in bed or at home. Song Dynasty commentator Fan Zuyu put it this way. The point is that if you do not allow relaxed, restful, vital essence to establish itself in your body, you'll never be refreshed, even if you do manage to stretch out your limbs. I'll wrap up this section by mentioning that the Analects never tells us to act 100% casually, 100% formally, or 100% anything for that matter. It always returns to the idea that every situation requires balanced and proper judgment. The way we're encouraged to move through the world is by completely internalizing the Tao, or the way, and achieving so-called full unity of the individual with the way of heaven, or Tianren Heyi. Reaching this level where it's second nature to know when to relax and how much to relax, when to act formally, and in what ways to act formally, or basically how to best engage with others in any situation, is why we see many seemingly contradictory and impossible to emulate statements throughout the Analects. Here are a couple. He was composed and yet fully at ease. That's written in passage 7.4. And the master was gentle yet firm, commanding yet not ferocious, respectful yet at ease. That's 7.38. It's not that these are intentionally impossible to achieve, but that the standard set by Confucius for one who was always able to engage with the world in the best way possible, it was practically impossible to put into words. If you think about it, there's no words for the perfect middle ground between being composed and being at ease, or being gentle, yet being firm. The term that best captures this idea in general is zhongyong, or constantly hitting the mark. That's something we'll definitely be digging into in later episodes. Next, let's discuss some of the language in these passages. First, we'll learn some of the vocabulary. 3 characters in these phrases refer to speech of different types: yu, yan, and wen. In modern Chinese, yu and yan, when put together as yu yan, simply mean language. But used alone in classical Chinese, yu means conversation, or possibly instruction, whereas yan is simply speaking, and not indicative of who is involved or what the purpose of the speech serves. Wen means exactly what it means today, to ask a question. In 10.10, we also see the character shi. In these phrases, it's a verb, so it means to eat, just like we used the verb shi today. This character still appears in modern Chinese. For example, liang shi means grain. It's also the radical or semantic component in many food-related words. Fan, for example, is food, and san is a meal. We see the character qin appear in both 10.10 and 10.24. It's referring to sleep or laying down to sleep. This character isn't commonly encountered in modern Chinese anymore, though it may be seen in some formal settings. An interesting note is that its usage is preserved in modern Japanese, where it's commonly seen in words like shinshitsu, or bedroom. Miao is a temple, and the character is still frequently found in modern Chinese. At the time of Confucius, it would be in reference specifically to an ancestral temple, because Buddhism and Taoism had not been established as traditions yet in China, and ancestor worship had been the mainstream as well as the official state practice since at least the beginning of the Shang dynasty, about 1,000 years before Confucius's time, and likely much longer. Shi is one of the most commonly used characters in modern Chinese, and it retains the meaning that we find in passage 10.21, that is, events. Shi has more breadth of meaning in classical Chinese than it does in modern Chinese, at least in my opinion. For example, it's frequently used to mean to serve, such as in the phrases shi jun, to serve a ruler, and shi fumu, to serve one's parents. Moving on to the grammar in these passages, 10.10 and 10.24 are very similar. They both consist of 2 parts, each of which is a verb-negative-verb pattern. For example, eat, don't converse, and sleep, don't lay like a corpse. Lay like a corpse is a single character here. As for the connection between these two parts, there's no obvious grammar we can use to link them. We just kind of have to assume that they're paired and that they have some topical or conceptual connection. 10.21 is different. It has an implied if-then or when/then structure. Essentially, it says, if entering the temple, then ask about all affairs. Last up, I'll note that the final character in 10.24 is not the same in all versions of the Analects. Here we see rong, or formal deportment. In other versions of the Analects, the character ke, or guest, appears instead. The way these two characters are written is quite similar, and there are a number of passages in the Analects where scribal errors over the centuries resulted in a mix-up between two characters. Occasionally, these mix-ups can be resolved by referencing archaeological discoveries, such as the Dingzhou version of the Analects. This was a manuscript discovered in 1973 that had been sealed in a cave since the 1st century BCE. Fortunately, in the case of 10.24, whether we use formal deportment or guest in this passage, the message doesn't really change much. It's still essentially that you should try to relax when you're at home. All right, folks. Well, that just about wraps it up for episode 7 of Exploring the Analects. Again, I'm your host, Elliot Bernstein. Join me next time for our very first encounter with the Confucian world's hands-down favorite character, Ren. Should we translate this as human-heartedness, humanity, benevolence, or compassion? I gotta be honest, I'm not so sure myself. But no worries, we'll have a great time figuring it out. See you there.